Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today, they finally released the updates for the Sage Advice Compendium after releasing the errata for the Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual last week. I believe that was last week, and this week was the Sage Advice Compendium. Of course, the errata are the actual changes to the rules, and the Sage Advice Compendium was something that was put together to sort of act as sort of an FAQ on a lot of the rules. My first impressions about it, because I had both up side by side and was kind of going through each question from the new one and trying to find it if it existed in the old one and if the answer had changed. But I passed by so many other questions that simply no longer exist in the 2024 Sage Advice Compendium, and some things that are in the old Sage Advice still are relevant if you had questions about it. So now it's going to create this sort of weird situation where if we're playing Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, of course if we're playing by the 2024 rules, of course we should refer to the 2024 rule books first. If we have any questions about anything that's in those, then we can refer to the Sage Advice Compendium to see if they have answered that question. But if they haven't, then we can refer to the old Sage Advice Compendium to see if it's answered that question, and then try to make any adjustments for 2024 if it's not super clear. I don't know. It's kind of having to balance between two versions of the same edition is a little wonky sometimes. But for the purposes of this video, we are just going to focus on things that are new in the Sage Advice Compendium for 2024, and also things that have been updated. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. We're going to start with the preface of the Sage Advice Compendium. They initially talk about the role of the rules. This is something that was in the old Sage Advice Compendium as well. It asks, why even have a Sage Advice when a DM can just make a ruling? It says, rules are a big part of what makes D&D a game rather than simply improvised storytelling. The game's rules are meant to help organize and even inspire the action of a D&D campaign. The rules are a tool, and we want our tools to be as effective as possible. No matter how good these tools might be, they need a group of players to bring them to life and a DM to guide their use. The DM is key. Many unexpected things can happen in a D&D campaign, and no set of rules could reasonably account for every contingency. If the rules tried to do so, the game would be unwieldy. An alternative would be for rules to severely limit what characters can do, which would be counter to the open-endedness of D&D. The direction we took for 5th edition was to lay a foundation of rules for what a DM could build on, and we celebrate the DM as a bridge between the things the rules address and the things they don't. In a typical D&D session, a DM makes numerous rules decisions, some barely noticeable, while others are quite obvious. Players also interpret the rules, and the whole group keeps the game running. There are times, though, when the design intent of a rule isn't clear, or when one rule seems to contradict another. Dealing with those situations is where Sage Advice comes in. It doesn't replace a DM's adjudication. Just as the rules do, this FAQ is meant to give DMs as well as players tools for tuning the game according to their tastes. Then they continue to explain that they often approach rules questions from one of three different perspectives, this being rules as written, also just called raw, or rules as intended, often called rye, or rules as fun, or RAF. I don't hear people bring this one up often, but you can also substitute like rule of cool as for this one as well. So rules as written, if you don't know, basically means what is written on the page in the book, and this is without any regard to what the designer's intent was when writing that rule. And they do say at the beginning here that says, when we consider a rule, we start with this perspective. I think that's something I mentioned at the end of the errata video when I was talking about the fact that Sage Advice was going to come out and that there were some things that weren't in errata that I imagine some people were looking for. And I was saying in that video that you shouldn't expect to see this in Sage Advice because the Sage Advice isn't for changing rules, simply for clarifying them. So if there was a change that you were hoping to see in errata, it's not going to be in the Sage Advice Compendium because they're going to start by saying, this is what the book says, this is how this works. They continue to explain that rules as intended is exactly what it sounds like. It's what the game designers intended when they wrote the rule. Ideally, rules as written and rules as intended would be a perfect match, but that's not always the case. And they say here when they write a rules as intended interpretation of the rule, they sort of pull back the curtain and let you know what their intent was. So usually they might say like, here's what the rule is in the book. Our intent was that it does this. An example of this in 2014 might have been like the paladins being able to smite or not smite with an unarmed strike. That might have been more of a mix of like rules as written versus rules as intended because there was a way to explain it within the rules. It just didn't always make perfect sense, I guess. It was very rules lawyery in the way that it was worded. Another example might have been the fact that druids in 2014 wouldn't wear metal armor, not that they couldn't, that they wouldn't. So that there was a design intent there that was sort of making a decision for your character. And then of course rules as fun as if a ruling doesn't make sense as written and you don't like the intent of the designers and you just like the way something works in your head better and it's fun for you and it's fun for your players. The DM is always able to say, you know what, at my table it's going to work this way. This usually ends up being sort of homebrew rules or even just house rules, things like that. And sometimes those will actually become the actual rules of the game, as we saw in 2024 with things like potions being a bonus action. And they even doubled down on that in 2024 by making all uses of the potion as a bonus action, whether you're taking it yourself or administering it to another player. So with all that aside, again, it's important to keep in mind that when they are answering these questions, the vast majority of the time, they're just saying this is what is written in the book and this is how it works. Sometimes they will say this is what our intent was, and usually that question needs to be asking, hey, this is confusing, was this your intent? And they'll say yes or no. It's very rare, at least that from what it seems to me, that they write from an intention perspective, and then I almost never see them rule as fun, although we might see one example later. So let's go ahead and get started with the first new or changed edition here. So we have a question that asks, if I'm hidden and a creature with a blind sight or true sight sees me, am I still hidden? This one is actually new to the Sage Advice Compendium. It says here that no, being hidden is a game state that gives you the invisible condition. If a creature finds you, you are no longer hidden and you lose that condition, as explained in the hide action in the player's handbook. This is pretty straightforward. If you are hidden, if something can see you, no matter how it can see you, you automatically lose that condition, not only from that creature, but from every other creature, which is again supported by the hide action rules in the player's handbook. This second question asks, the stun condition no longer prevents you from moving. Is this change intentional? So this is a very clear example of when they're going to be ruling rules as intended. So it says, yes, we have intentionally increased the differences between the stunned and paralyzed condition, with stunned now allowing you to move. That's actually kind of nice because that was always very confusing even to me as well, as like, why can stunned creatures move where they couldn't move before? So it's nice to know that they're at least aiming to differentiate stunned and paralyzed, which makes sense to me. I mean, it's still weird that a stunned creature can move, but I see what they were going for at least. The next question here, it asks, how do I tell if something is magical? This is a question that existed in the previous compendium, and the only thing that's really changed here is that they are referring now to a section in the player's handbook, whereas the explanation for this was previously in the Dungeon Master's Guide. The final question that is new or changed in the adventuring section asks, what happens after level 20? Is there a cap to a character's levels? Again, this was in the old compendium, is also slightly changed in the new compendium, where it now refers to a sidebar in the player's handbook, talking about bonus feats at level 20. Usually this is going to be referring to the epic boons. If you are quote unquote progressing after level 20, instead of gaining another level, you could just gain another epic boon or whatever your DM decides to reward you with. So those are all the new or changed items in the adventuring section. Now let's talk about combat. So the first question asks, can you move through the space of a prone enemy? This question was in the old compendium and it's now also in the new one because the rules around it have changed. We've talked a lot about the rules about going through a creature space in many of my previous videos about pushing creatures into other spaces, and now that you can knock them prone that way. But also just generally the rules around what kind of creature spaces you can move through have changed. So it now says that you can move through the space of an enemy only if that enemy has the incapacitated condition, is a tiny creature, or is at least 2 sizes larger or smaller than you. The prone condition does not override this, so whether or not they're prone is completely irrelevant. The next question asks, how does readying a spell work? Do you lose your spell slot if the trigger never occurs? Again, this was in the previous compendium, but the ruling is a little bit more clear here in the sense that it explains why you lose these resources and the fact that you expend all the resources when you initially cast that spell to ready it because you're holding the magic energy there, preparing to release it as a reaction. And then if you were to go into the rules glossary and look at the ready action, it actually does say that when you ready a spell, it is only effective until the beginning of your next turn. So if you don't use it, you lose it completely, including the resources that you spent when you initially took the ready action and ready that spell. Moving on, we have some rules around opportunity attack. So the first question says, how does a reach weapon work without an opportunity attack? The second question asks, can a blinded creature make an opportunity attack? Both of these questions were in the previous compendium, and both of these answers are basically the same, if not exactly the same. But the more important thing here is what question they didn't answer, which is a big question that people have been asking in the 2024 rules, is whether or not you can make an opportunity attack against an allied creature. Because the rule around making an opportunity attack in 2024, they removed the word hostile in front of the word creature, which now suggests that you could use this on an ally to either, use a reaction to make an unarmed strike and then push them to give them a little boost in movement. If you have Warcaster, you can use a buff spell, like when the barbarian leaves your reach, you can cast haste on them at the beginning of combat with your reaction. So nowhere in the Sage Advice Compendium do they answer that question. There is like one part here in the second question where it says, can a blinded creature make an opportunity attack? It says an opportunity attack is triggered when a creature that you can see leaves your reach. So again, it doesn't say a hostile creature. It does continue to say that if you can't see an enemy, you can't make an opportunity attack against it. So it does say enemy there, but that's just an example. The first sentence here is the rule about how you make an opportunity attack. So I personally think that idea is cool about being able to use your opportunity attacks in such a way that you can benefit your allies. I don't think it's inherently broken. I think it opens up a lot of cool strategies, but I do think that it is very strange that they didn't clarify that anywhere within the Sage Advice Compendium. The next question here says, can an opportunity attack be used to make a grapple or shove? This answer has actually changed in the 2024 compendium. Previously, it was no, because the rules for the grapple and the shove specifically said they need to be taken as part of the attack action, and obviously you can't do that as a reaction. But now that grapples and shoves are now like different modes of the unarmed strike, you can make an unarmed strike as an opportunity attack, which means that you can now grapple or shove as part of an opportunity attack. Moving on, we have a question that asks, can a non-battle master attempt to disarm someone? Again, this was in the previous compendium, but basically the context context around this has changed in 2024. It says here that a disarming maneuver is designed for the Battlemaster fighter, but any character can try to disarm a foe. Such an attempt would fall under improvising an action not detailed by the rules, and that would be up to your DM to adjudicate. Previously in 2014, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there were like a bunch of optional combat rules, one of which was a disarm, which would have been similar to the way that you grapple or shove. It just would have been a disarm attempt, but that is noticeably absent from the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. And now they're basically just leaving it completely up to however the DM would want to adjudicate it. Personally, as a DM, I would probably still consider using the old ones that were in the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. Maybe I would update the rules to be more in line with the design philosophy of the 2024 rules. But generally speaking, in the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, I liked a lot of the optional combat rules in there. And then finally, we're getting to a question that I know is on a lot of people's minds, or maybe was on a lot of people's minds. This is a question that is asking, can I make an attack with a light weapon, then draw a second weapon with my other hand and qualify to make the extra attack of the light property? And the answer here is yes. The only requirement for the light property's extra attack is that it's made with a different light weapon. So this is actually kind of funny because they're answering the question that people aren't exactly asking. People have been asking, hey, can I attack with a light weapon, use the attack action, equip and unequip rules to stow that weapon, and then on the nick attack, can I draw another weapon and make the light weapon property attack with one hand only? You know, that's the question many people have been asking. However, I still think this is the exact answer that they would give in that situation. Because again, what they're saying here is that the only requirement for the light property's extra attack is that it's made with a different light weapon, not a different light weapon in another hand. That the only requirement for the light property's extra attack is that it's made with a different light weapon. While the question isn't the right question, I believe that their answer would be the same in both circumstances. Moving on to some general class feature rules, they ask, when you use extra attack, do you have to use the same weapon for all attacks? The answer is the same as it was in the 2014 compendium, but however, it does add a little bit more context that is relevant to the 2024 rules. This one now refers to the equipping and unequipping weapons as part of the attack action rules that exists in the rules glossary. So no, you don't need to use the same weapon for all attacks, but if you are going to, switch weapons out, you do need to follow the equipping and unequipping weapon rules as described here below. Moving on to a Bard class feature. If used on a damage roll, does College of Lore Bards cutting words apply to any kind of damage roll, including an auto hit spell like magic missile? So actually nothing has changed in the text that you're looking at. What has changed here is what is no longer asked or answered as part of this question. In the 2014 compendium, there was a question that asked, is the intent that a bard gets to know a number rolled on an attack roll or ability check before using cutting words, or should they always guess? Because in the 2014 lore bard, you could see the roll, but you had to decide whether or not to use cutting words before you knew the result of that roll, like whether you knew it was a success or a failure. However, they no longer needed to answer that in 2024 because cutting words now can only happen if a creature succeeds on an ability check or saving throw. So now you know the result of the roll, and you can choose to apply it when that creature succeeds. Moving on to another bard feature, it asks, which spell scrolls can bards understand? Spells from the bard list only, or spells from the bard list plus spells from magical secrets? The answer here is generally the same, but they provided a little bit more context in the second two paragraphs. Basically, the way that it works is that a bard can use a spell scroll of any spell that is on the bard spell list, and then if they have spells from magical secrets that are from other classes, and they have that spell learned on their own spell list, and they have a spell scroll for that spell that they learned through magical secrets, then they can use a spell scroll of that spell. However, if they have like a spell scroll of clone and they don't have the clone spell from the wizard spell list, they have not learned that through magical secrets, then they are unable to use that scroll. But this isn't actually like changing the rule in any way, it is just making it clearer. Moving on to the druid, it asks, can a bound and gagged druid simply use wild shape to get out? It's hard to capture someone who can turn into a mouse at will. Again, this is basically the same as it was in 2014, it just has some additional context. The rules around manacles in 2024 say that they are designed for a small or medium creature. So of course, if a druid is in manacles and they wild shape into a tiny creature, the manacles would no longer be able to keep them shackled, so they would just get out of them easily. However, they've also added some context here that shapeshifting into a smaller creature doesn't necessarily end the grappled or restrained condition. If you are grappled by a small creature, shapeshifting into a tiny creature doesn't end the grappled condition. However, if you are grappled by a small creature and then you wild shape into a large creature, you cannot grapple a creature that is more than 2 sizes larger than you. So then you would actually break the grapple condition that way. Moving on to some rogue features, it asks, can a rogue use evasion even if they are surprised? The answer is basically the same, but the reasoning is different. It says, yes, being surprised at the start of combat causes the creature to have disadvantage on the initiative roll. A rogue can use evasion as long as they don't have the incapacitated condition. This next question asks, can a rogue's reliable talent feature be used in conjunction with other features, like the champion's remarkable athlete or the bard's jack of all trade feature? Masters. Again, this question was in the old compendium. The rulings around it have changed a little bit with the 2024 rules. Well, the answer is still no for Jack of all trades, because Jack of all trades requires you to be not proficient in them. They don't grant you proficiency in those skills. They just allow you to add a bonus equal to half of your proficiency. However, for a remarkable athlete, the answer has changed. Previously, this was also no. In 2014, remarkable athlete said that you can add half your proficiency bonus rounded up to any strength, dexterity, or constitution check that doesn't already make use of your proficiency bonus. So very similar to Jack of all trades, it required you to not already be proficient in those skills, which means that you could not use it with reliable talent. However, now in 2024, remarkable athlete says that you have an advantage on initiative rolls and strength athletics checks. So reliable talent and remarkable athlete don't really intersect anymore. If anything, remarkable athlete specifically for athletics would make reliable talent a little less reliable because you're more likely to roll high on those rolls. So they do kind of stack in a way, but not really in the way that the question is asking. Moving on to sorcerers, we have a question that asks, does Quicken Spell allow sorcerer to cast 2 spells around of level 1+? The answer is kind of the same, but also a little different because, again, the rules around casting more than one spell on a turn have changed. Previously, if you cast a spell as a bonus action, you can only cast a spell that is a cantrip with a casting time of 1 action using your action. In 2024, you can only cast 1 spell with a spell slot per turn. So let's say that I cast Fireball with a spell slot using my action, but I have a free Misty Step from the Fey Touched feat. I can cast both of those spells on my turn, provided that I'm using the free use of it once per day for the Misty Step. However, if I do have a free casting of any other spell that requires an action, I can use my Quicken spell to quicken that free casting of that action as a bonus action, and then cast another spell using a spell slot as my action as well. So there are ways to use Quicken spell to cast more than 2 spells of level 1 or higher. You just need to follow the rules of casting only 1 spell with a spell slot per turn. This next question asks, can my sorcerer use twin spell on a spell duplicated by the casting of a wish spell? So the answer here says that yes, you can, as long as the duplicated spell meets the requirements of the twinned spell. This was also in the previous Sage Advice Compendium, and I never actually read this rule, but I think from a rules as written perspective, this is still technically wrong, because you can only twin a spell that you cast, and you're not actually casting the spell from wish. It is simply duplicated. So I have the 2024 rule of wish here. I have the 2014 below it. It says the basic use of the spell is to duplicate any other spell of 8th level or lower. It does say in 2024, if you use it this way, you don't need to meet any requirements to cast that spell, including costly components. But I mean, this basically just means that you don't need components, you need to meet the timing restrictions of it. You don't need to meet the class restrictions of it. You don't need to have the spell slot to cast. You don't need to meet any of the requirements that you would have needed to cast that spell. But then it continues to say the spell simply takes effect. So you cast wish, and then instantaneously, because wish is an instantaneous spell, the effects of whatever spell that you're duplicating immediately take effect. Like the wording on this is more similar to the Artificer's spell storing item, which simply recreates the effects of the spell that is stored inside it. And it's much less like the Divine Intervention in 2024, which actually states very clearly, as part of the same action, you cast the spell. If the spell that wish is duplicating was actually cast, that is the kind of text that I would expect to see in the rules of wish. So this is kind of an example where I feel like the designers are actually ruling as fun, because it certainly is fun. I'm not saying that I wouldn't let my sorcerers twin a spell that they duplicate with wish, provided of course that it does meet the conditions for the twinned spell. But I feel like that's maybe just like a nuance that they missed when answering this question, or this is maybe rules as intended and they just aren't making that clear. But it is fun, and I would certainly let my players do this if they wanted to. Moving on to the Warlock features, we have a question that asks, does the Awakened Mind feature of a Warlock with the Great Old One patron allow 2-way telepathic communication? Again, this question existed in the old compendium, but the answer is now different. Whereas the answer was no previously, the answer is now yes. This is specifically because the rules for telepathy have changed in 2024. Previously, telepathy was a 1-way communication unless it's stated otherwise. The basic rules for telepathy now state a creature without telepathy can receive telepathic messages but can't initiate telepathic conversations. Once a telepathic conversation starts, a non-telepath can communicate mentally to the telepath until that telepathic connection ends. So the Great Olden Warlock can communicate telepathically with another creature. While that communication is ongoing, that creature can communicate back telepathically, even if they aren't themselves a telepath. Moving on to Wizard features, we have a question that asks, does casting Alarm as a ritual heal Arcane Ward? This is specifically for the Abjuration Wizard. The answer for this one used to be yes, because you just needed to cast an Abjuration spell. It did not require you to cast it with a spell slot. In 2024, the Abjuration Wizard was changed that the Arcane Ward, you do need to cast an Abjuration spell with a spell slot in order to recharge it, or you can use a bonus action to just expend a spell slot and recharge it a little bit. But you can no longer ritually cast a spell and recharge your ward that way, nor can you cast a free spell such as the At-Will Mage Armor from the Warlock was a pretty popular combo as well. You can't recharge it those ways anymore. Moving on to another question about Arcane Ward, it asks, how does Arcane Ward interact with temporary hit points that an Abjurer might have? The answer this time has changed because the rules around how the Arcane Ward works have changed in 2024. Previously, you could not apply resistances or vulnerabilities or anything to the ward, but now the rules for the ward say that whenever you take damage, the ward takes damage instead. And if you have any resistances or vulnerabilities, apply them before reducing the ward's hit points. So in answering this question, they provided a list of how they say that this should work. So first things first, when you're taking damage, you apply any resistances and vulnerabilities to that damage. You then apply that remaining damage to the arcane ward. If the arcane ward is reduced to 0 and then there's any damage left over, then you would consider any immunities. If you are not immune to that damage then goes through to your temporary hit points. And then once your temporary hit points are out, then they're applied, of course, then to your real hit points. I've never really liked the rulings around arcane ward, and what's interesting to me here still in 2024 is that they're putting immunity after arcane ward. So even though it says whenever you take damage, the ward is damaged instead, but if you're immune, you don't take damage. Immunity is separate completely from resistance and vulnerability. If we look at the order of application of damage in the player's handbook, it doesn't even mention immunity at all. It is a separate section from resistance and vulnerability in the first place. So it doesn't really make sense to me that immunity would apply after arcane ward. I think it would be the first thing that you consider. I think one thing they left out here in this sort of order of operations in the Sage Advice Compendium is the first part of the order of application, which is bonuses, penalties, and multipliers. And judging by the way that they're listing this out, I think this would come between steps 3 and 4. So let's say that you take some fire damage, you have resistance to fire damage, so you have that damage. That damage goes through your arcane ward. There's some damage left over. You're not immune to fire damage, so then you could potentially use like the resistance cantrip. If you have that going and you could reduce the damage by 1d4, that would apply between steps 3 and 4. If you are a Goliath and you have like the stone's endurance effect, you can do that between steps 3 and 4. And then any remaining damage after that is applied to temporary hit points and then real hit points. One actual interesting thing about the fact that resistances are now considered before flat reductions, such as like from resistance or stone's endurance, is that it now makes it easier to reduce that damage to 0. It still needs to go through your arcane ward first, but normally since you have to do the flat reduction first and then apply resistance, it makes it much harder to reduce things to 0, because let's say you go from 10 to 5 and then you have to half 5 to 2.5. But if you start with 10 and then you have it with resistance to 5 and then you reduce it by 5, then it's 0. So it makes it much easier to reduce things to 0, which is kind of cool. But yeah, I just don't agree that immunity comes third. I would say that it still comes first in my opinion. That's how I'd rule it at my table at least. Like I understand like thematically that the ward is a barrier between you and incoming damage, and that's why it gets hit first. But let's say that there's an example where, let's say I'm poisoned by something and then like every turn I have to make a saving throw or I take damage from the poison. You know, that's an internal damage, so the ward isn't really blocking that from coming in, but nonetheless the ward would still absorb that damage. So the whole argument that, okay, well, it's an external barrier, that's why it gets hit first, doesn't really hold up when you consider all the ways that you could potentially take damage, not just from external sources. So if you're ever an Abjurer in one of my games, you know, I'd happily let that slide, especially because immunity is so rare in the first place. So for more wizard rulings, we're going to ask here, for a wizard to cast a ritual spell contained in their spellbook, do they need to read from the book or use it as part of the ritual? This question was also in the previous compendium, but the answer now has changed because the rule for Ritual Adept does now actually say that you need to be reading from your spellbook in order to cast a ritual spell. However, you do only need to be doing this if you don't have that ritual spell prepared. So if you have a ritual spell prepared, you can ritually cast it without referring to your spellbook. If you don't have it prepared, then you do need to be reading it from your spellbook in order to ritually cast it. Those are all the sort of class rules. Let's move on to rules around feats. First one is for the Charger feat. It says, if you have the Charger feat, you can use the charge attack benefit while mounted. Previously in the 2014 compendium, the answer to this one was no, but it is now yes in 2024, but only on a controlled mount. The reasoning for this being no in 2014 is that the rule for the Charger feat in 2014 required you to take the dash action. However, in 2024, the only requirement here is that you move 10 feet in a straight line toward the target before hitting with a melee attack as part of the attack action. So if you have a controlled mount and that mount moves 10 feet closer to a target, you then qualify for the charge attack on Charger. It does differentiate between controlled and uncontrolled mounts because a controlled mount acts on your turn, whereas an uncontrolled mount or an independent mount has its own initiative and is not acting on your turn. Moving on to Crossbow Expert, it asks, does Crossbow Expert let you fire a hand crossbow and then fire it again as a bonus action? The answer to this one has actually changed in 2024 because the answer is kind of no. You can fire a hand crossbow as a bonus action in using the Crossbow Expert feat. However, you do need to still obey the light weapon property rule that it needs to be a different light weapon or a hand crossbow in this case. So you can fire a hand crossbow, stow it, and then as your next attack, bring out the second hand crossbow and fire that one. As your bonus action, it just can't be the same one. The next question asks, can my character wield 2 heavy weapons if they have the dual wielder feat? The answer to this one hasn't changed. It's no, you can't do that. However, there is a wording here that I think is important to some questions that maybe we have been asking since the 2024 handbooks came out. The first sentence here says the dual wielder feat allows you to simultaneously draw 2 weapons that lack the two-handed property. So I think that word simultaneously is pretty key because it was kind of a little unclear, ambiguous, whether the quick draw feature allowed you to, make an attack and then possibly stow a weapon and then draw a weapon with the same hand. However, I wouldn't say that's simultaneously, of course, because that's not at the same time. So whatever happens as part of that action, I guess, does need to happen within the same sort of movement, I guess you could call it. So you do need to simultaneously either draw 2 weapons or simultaneously stow 2 weapons. I guess it still is maybe a little unclear if you could stow one weapon with one hand and then draw another weapon with a different hand, because that is still simultaneous. I don't really think that matters ultimately, but I just wanted to point out the word simultaneously here because it does answer at least one question that I've asked myself within the new 2024 rules. I do imagine that maybe some people are a little disappointed that there are no rules here around whether or not the attack from the dual wielder feat requires you to use your other hand, of course, because it is called dual wielder. But again, considering the answer they had about the light weapon property, I imagine that their answer would be the same thing for dual wielder, even though it's called dual wielder. And we'll actually talk about that more in a little bit. The next question here is around the great weapon fighting style, which is technically a fighting style feat in 2024. So they had a similar question in the 2014 rules, but the rules around how great weapon fighting work have changed in 2024, so they needed to update it. The answer is basically the same as it's asking here. If you have great weapon fighting and you use divine smite or a spell like hex, can you treat any 1 or 2 on the damage rolls from those sources as a 3 using the new great weapon fighting rules? Their answer here is no, that it would only apply to the base weapon damage. This is technically the same way that they ruled it in the 2014 rules. However, it is unclear if that would also then apply to things like the Berserker Barbarian's Frenzy attack, or if you had like a finesse weapon with the versatile property, which I think there's maybe like 1 or 2 magic items at least that would qualify for that. You could use sneak attack with those weapons. Could you use great weapon fighting with the Berserker Frenzy or the sneak attack with an appropriate weapon that could qualify for that? Obviously, divine smite and hex are spells, so maybe they're trying to differentiate spell damage from base weapon damage, but they could also just be saying that the rule for great weapon fighting is only supposed to apply to the actual base weapon damage of the weapon. So even though the frenzy damage does the same damage type as the weapon, that doesn't necessarily mean that it counts as the weapon's damage, which again doesn't really make sense in the way that we think about it, but I would have to imagine that maybe that's their intent. And so I would still be interested to see them provide a little bit more clarity around that, because if it is just applying to the base weapon damage, then great weapon fighting is for sure much worse than it was in 2014. Unless you have some magic item like maybe like a vicious greatsword, it would be decent. It would be like basically the same as dueling at that point. For just a normal weapon, if it's just the base weapon damage, great weapon fighting really isn't really that good. Moving on to rules around spellcasting, we're starting with which of a character's spells count as class spells. For example, if I'm playing a sorcerer, which of my character spells are sorcerer's spells? This is actually a new question to the Sage Advice Compendium. This is pretty clear within the rules, and it's kind of covered in the multi-classing rules, that you prepare spells for each class as if you were a member of that class. So spells on your sorcerer spell list are sorcerer spells. Spells on your bard spell list are bard spells, no matter how you're multi-classed. The next question is kind of unique. It says some spells like Guiding Bolt target a creature. Some spells like Firebolt target objects too. Does this mean that I can't attack a door with a guiding bolt? The answer here says the target specifications, creature, object, or something else in the spells are intentional. The funny thing here is that it's the question that is different here. The answer is exactly the same. Guiding bolt used to be Eldritch Blast, because Eldritch Blast in 2014 couldn't target objects. The mean was that you could use Eldritch Blast to be a minesweeper for mimics, because if you shoot an Eldritch Blast at a chest and it doesn't go off, then that means that it's an actual object. But if it does go off, then it means that it's a mimic. However, in 2024, they changed Eldritch Blast to be able to target both creatures and objects, so they had to change the wording of this question. The next question asks, can you cast a reaction spell on your turn? The answer to this one is still yes. However, the context around it has changed slightly, because now we have that rule in 2024 that we can only cast one spell with a spell slot per turn. So normally in 2014, if we cast a fireball and then someone tried to counter us, we could still cast counterspell on our turn. However, in 2024, if you cast fireball using a spell slot and an enemy tries to counterspell you, you can no longer counterspell them as long as you're casting that counterspell with a spell slot. However, if I have like a free casting of a spell from a feature or something like that, and I try to cast that spell and then someone tries to counter me, I can then try to counter that back with my own counterspell using a spell slot. The next question asks, can a spellcaster dismiss a spell after casting it? This one has a new answer as well. This used to be no, but in 2024 they actually changed the rules around that. You can now dismiss a non-instantaneous spell. So normally if you're concentrating on a spell, you can just end concentration on that spell and sort of dismiss it that way. That was always the case. However, for non-instantaneous spells that have a duration and have an ongoing effect but aren't concentration, in 2014 2014, you couldn't end those without casting Dispel Magic. But in 2024, if it has a duration and doesn't require concentration, if you are the caster of that spell, you can immediately end the effect of that spell whenever you want. The next question asks, can you extend the duration of Armor of Agathis by gaining more temporary hit points? The answer to this in 2014 was no, but in 2024, this one is now yes, because they changed the wording of that spell. I know when the Player's Handbook initially came out, this was pretty controversial at the time because people thought maybe it was a typo, but there's also just other like shape change spells that also work very similarly to the way Armor of Agathis does, where they last for as long as you have temporary hit points, and so as if you gain temporary hit points from other places, you can also extend the duration of those spells. So I'm really not surprised that they are ruling it this way. This makes sense according to the way that not only Armor of Agathis is worded now in 2024, but also other spells where it's clearly like, okay, they did the same thing in multiple different locations. This is clearly intentional. I do feel like they maybe could have answered this question a little more clearly, because the question asks, can you extend the duration of Armor of Agathis by gaining more hit points? You can't extend the actual duration of the spell, which is 1 hour, but you can stop it from ending early by gaining more temporary hit points so you don't run out of them before the duration ends. The next question asks, I find it confusing that the Mage Armor spell is named that when it doesn't count as armor. I guess this isn't actually a question. The answer here says, some spells and class features are figurative, not literal names. And it says, the text of a spell or class feature explains what it does. This is actually completely unchanged from the 2014 Sage Advice Compendium, but I did want to point it out because I don't know if I've ever mentioned it in a video, but I believe I have like commented, not even on my videos, maybe like on Reddit or other forums, that the name of a feature doesn't have any bearing on the rules of that feature. You know, something that people might argue that for in 2024 would be the Dual-Wielding feat. You know, technically you don't need to use a second hand to make that extra attack as part of the Dual-Wielding feat, even though it's called Dual-Wielding. But, you know, the name doesn't matter. The name has never mattered. The spell Chill Touch existed for 10 years as neither a cold damage or touch range spell, and it is still not both. The only thing that actually impacts the rules of a feature is what the rules text of the feature says about it. We could have a feature called Blorgesplot's Wild Ride, and it could be the exact text for the Dual Wielder feat, and it wouldn't make a difference. Like, you know, we could both agree that that's not a very aptly named feature, but that has no bearing on the actual function of it. Of course, as DMs, we're allowed to, of course, make any ruling that we want at our table if we don't think that it makes sense for a feat called Dual Wielder to allow us to make the second attack with the same hand. The next question asks, if you grapple or shove an enemy, does that end a Sanctuary spell cast on you? The answer here has changed in 2024. Now, the answer is no. The Sanctuary spell only ends if the warded creature makes an attack roll, casts a spell, or deals damage. The grapple or shove options of the unarmed strike do none of these things. So previously, Sanctuary in 2014 ended if you made an attack, not an attack roll. So if you made any kind of attack, which the grapple and shoves were referred to as special melee attacks, that would of course end the Sanctuary spell. But now that Sanctuary in 2024 says an attack roll, and grapple and shove both don't use attack rolls, they are just saving throws. They no longer break Sanctuary, which is kind of actually cool. I don't know if there's a way to like abuse that, but it seems like a cool thing that you can maybe try to build around. But again, grapples and shoves are saving throws, so they're not quite as reliable as they were in 2014. There might be something there. We'll have to maybe look at that later. The next question asks, can you use True Strike with extra attack, opportunity attack, sneak attack, or other weapon attack options? I feel like most of us who take the time to absorb content online about Dungeons & Dragons already understand where the new True Strike fits in the action economy of Dungeons & Dragons. Of course, you can't use it as part of extra attack unless you are like an Eldritch Knight with the War Magic feature that allows them to cast a cantrip with the casting time of 1 action as in place of one of their attacks. You can't do it as an opportunity attack, even with Warcaster, because True Strike has a range of self, and the spell that you cast from Warcaster needs to only target the creature that you're targeting with the opportunity attack. True Strike and Sneak Attack can go together. You just need to remember that True Strike is a cantrip, which has a casting time of 1 action, which means that it normally uses the magic action. So unless there is another rule making an exception, such as the War Magic feature of the Eldritch Knight, you need to use the magic action to do that. It is not part of your attack action. And that also means that when you are casting True Strike using the magic action, by definition, you are not taking the attack action. You are making an attack, but it is not the attack action. Moving on to magic items, we're asking, can potions be administered to unconscious characters? The answer is yes, you can administer a potion to someone else as a bonus action. This used to be an action in 2014, but it's now a bonus action in 2024. And the very final new or updated question in the Sage Advice Compendium says, can you gain the magical bonus of a +2 shield if you are holding the shield without taking an action to don it? The answer in 2014 was yes. However, they changed their tune in 2024 to now say no, you must don a shield to gain its benefits. So for example, in 2014, if you had a +2 shield, which would normally give you +4 to AC if you had it donned, they had previously ruled that if you were just holding the shield but like weren't wielding it as a shield, you would still gain the +2 benefit, the magical benefit of that shield, as long as you were holding it. However, in 2024, they're saying no, you need to actually take the time to don the shield to gain the full benefits of that shield. And what's actually kind of interesting about this is that they're just changing their intent, because the text of the rules between 2014 and 2024 2024 haven't changed. You know, the wording of the actual shields, the magic items themselves haven't changed. The wording around shields in the player's handbook haven't changed. If anything, it's less clear in 2024 because they pruned a lot of other text. So this is them into saying, you know what, we changed our mind in 2024. You can no longer gain that extra bonus. You need to actually be donning and using the shield. And of course, you know, per the rules, be proficient with it to gain all the benefits of that shield. So that clearly signals a change in their intent, and I'm personally fine with it. I thought that little trick was a little cheesy anyway, but so that is all the changes in the Sage Advice Compendium. It's much shorter than I thought it was going to be. Again, there's a lot of questions that are still existing in the old Sage Advice Compendium that I think are still relevant that they didn't port over. There's some questions in the Sage Advice Compendium that are no longer relevant, and that's why they didn't port them over. I think overall, I'm pretty satisfied with most of the things in here. I'm a little surprised that they didn't, you know, address the question on opportunity attacks. I'm a little surprised that they didn't answer the right questions around things like the light weapon property, or didn't answer the question around the dual wielding feat, things like that, to clarify that. You know, those questions come up weekly on like Reddit and things like that. But let me know what you think about anything that was covered here in the new Sage Advice Compendium. Did I miss anything? I'm pretty confident that I got most of everything that was new in the Sage Advice Compendium or changed in the Sage Advice Compendium. If I missed something, certainly let me know down in the comments. If there's anything that you wished was in the Sage Advice Compendium that I haven't mentioned already, definitely let me know that as well. I'd be interested to hear what you guys are maybe unclear on. Maybe I can try to provide some insight if I haven't already, if you care what I think anyway. So let me know all that down in the comments below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more from me, please consider hitting that subscribe button and support the channel. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one.